Jerusalem Connection Red Alert Report for October 7. Do you want the good news or the bad news? How about we start with the good news? To follow up on my report about 2 weeks ago about an education bill in California that mandated state university college students take a certain ethnic studies course in order to graduate, well, we have some good news on that regard. This bill mandated a so-called ethnic studies course whose curriculum specifically targets and vilifies Israel and is rather anti-Semitic to be achieved before the student can graduate. At the urging of many Jewish and Israeli advocacy groups, Governor Newsom did veto the bill, and for this we are quite grateful. While some of our more mature and aged leaders are seeing the light, it is with sadness that I have to report within 2 major U.S. universities within the last month, antisemitism has been demonstrated to be alive and well. At Columbia University in New York City on Tuesday, September 29th, following a joint proposal put forward by the BDS and local chapters of the Students for Justice in Palestine and the Jewish Voice for Peace, students at Columbia University voted by a majority of 61% to boycott Israel. This is disappointing to say the very least. A federal complaint, in fact, was filed in December of last year, accusing the school of anti-Semitic discrimination after swastikas were posted on walls outside a Jewish professor's office, staff were sharing and posting anti-Semitic tropes, and Jewish students were made to feel both unsafe and victimized. The university's president, Lee Bollinger, earlier this year published a statement tying the movement of boycott, divest, and sanction, BDS, of Israel to the rise in anti-Semitism. He responded to the student vote last week that this would not change the university's investment policies. So while the student vote is largely symbolic, it is overtly telling about the mindset of many students studying at one of America's most elite universities. To further complicate the delicate and sensitive topic of racial relations in the U.S. and the idea to eradicate racism and discrimination in all its form, both at the community and personal level, as well as the institutional or systemic level, the University of Illinois students passed a resolution urging divestment from Israel. The problem is this resolution was bundled with a vote to support the Black Lives Matter movement. Jewish groups on campus responded, quote, "This is an attempt to paint Israel and Jews as the obstacle to racial equality." The university's Office of Student Affairs actually condemned the non-binding resolution, which passed 22 to 11 with 7 abstentions. The Student Affairs Office published, quote, "It is unfortunate that a resolution before the group tonight was designed to force students to oppose the efforts to divest from Israel to also then vote against the Black Lives Matter movement," unquote. They also said in a joint statement signed by Chancellor Robert Jones and 5 vice chancellors that this resolution includes several points on which we can actually agree, but a fundamental value of this institution is inclusion, and this resolution includes language that we cannot support. So I'm glad the leadership of the school did point this out. Back in February at the University of Illinois, the student government passed a resolution by a vote of 20 to 9, 7 abstentions, that called on the university once again to divest from companies that, quote, "profit from human rights violations in Palestine and other communities globally." They named 3 specific companies in particular: Raytheon, Elbit Systems, and Northrop Grumman. But later that same week, the student body's president actually vetoed the resolution, saying its passage made, quote, "students feel unsafe and it had fostered a climate of hate on campus." After 5 failed attempts in 5 years to pass BDS on campus, student activists have enshrouded the calls for divestment within a resolution opposing anti-Black violence. The Hillel Cohen Center for Jewish Life at the university said on its Facebook page, quote, "This is an attempt to paint Israel and Jews as the obstacle to racial equality amidst the holiest time on the Jewish calendar. The Jewish students refuse to submit to this anti-Semitic litmus test. Instead, they issued a joint statement of principles declaring their steadfast commitment to Zionism and racial justice. During their meeting, the student senators made clear that they are driven by their Jewish values, which call for social, racial, and environmental justice. Jewish and Zionist students who are committed to racial equality are left no choice in these conflated votes, because racial equality actually includes equal treatment for Jews and the protections of their civil rights and human rights. Discrimination on identity, in fact, is what they want to fight. And to carve out Israel by default, and by default Jews, this is a very antithesis of what the Black Lives Matter is supposed to be espousing. Equality is not based on the color of skin or religion or culture of origin. Not only that, the real issue of the Palestinian suffering is not about Israel. And since the UAE, Bahrain, and Israeli Abraham Accords, more and more Arab neighbors are speaking out about what we and Israel have been saying for decades. Palestinians' biggest problem is their own leadership. So BLM, if they are committed to Palestinian reform, they need to direct their hate elsewhere. As Joshua David Washington, director of the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, noted on his Facebook page just last week, and I quote, "The majority of Palestinians in Gaza know that Hamas is the source of their problems. The ones who actually speak up about it or try to do something about it get jailed or killed." This is evidenced by the We Want to Live 2019 protests that occurred in Gaza. The protests were against Hamas, and Hamas wound up torturing and killing many Palestinians, their journalists and their people. This is also evidenced by the 3 peace activists who will most likely face prison for years for simply having a video chat with Israelis. If you say you're for justice for the Palestinians, but will ultimately ignore these things, you don't give about Palestinians. You just hate Jews. Next to Hamas and Abbas, you are the biggest enemy of the Palestinian people. Don't come to me anymore talking about, but what about the occupation? Your true colors are showing. Joshua David Washington, by the way, in case it matters, happens to be a black man. May we all keep our leaders and our schools and our students in our constant prayers. Shavua Tov, and have a great week.